Do the New York Mets have enough pitching to be competitive in 2024? I'll break it all down on today's edition of Locked On Mets.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. Today's episode is brought to you by Jase Medical. Empower yourself when you purchase a Jase case, providing you with a personal supply of 5 antibiotics that treat 50-plus infections. Get yours today at jasemedical.com. Use the code LOCKEDON to get $20 off your order. That's Jase Medical, Jase medical.com. When the New York Mets added Sean Manaea over the weekend, it seemed like that might be the last addition for their starting rotation. I broke down that signing at length on Sunday's show, but now I want to look at where the rotation stands and what they have to do to actually be competitive this season. I do believe the Mets have enough pitching depth. They have plenty of options, and we'll discuss those in the next segment. But what I want to focus on right now is the frontline starting pitching, because there's only one guy, and that's Kodai Senga. And the Mets need a lot out of Senga this season. If they're going to win this year, he needs to finish in the top 10 in the NL Cy Young voting again. Last year, he finished 7th as a rookie, made 29 starts, had a 2.98 ERA, and 202 strikeouts and 166 in the third innings pitched. Can he get to 180 innings? I think that's possible. And you look at what he did in the second half, he pitched to a 2.58 ERA in 13 starts. So there is that in there. He can be extremely dominant, and the Mets need him to be that guy, because you look at the rest of this rotation, find me another starter that's going to get you to 180 innings and a sub-3 ERA, much less. There's no other viable candidate that can do that. I mean, the best bet to maybe give you that type of ace production is Luis Severino, and that is so far removed from when he was able to pitch to that level that it's impossible to expect it. I just can't see Quintana or Manaea being that type of dominant. I just can't. I think they can be good, but to be an elite guy who's in the top 10 in Cy Young, I don't see it, and I really don't see it for Severino either. It's just he has the stuff with the velocity he still throws to potentially do it. But really, it's Kodai Senga. It's his team. It's his rotation. He's got to be an absolute ace. Now, if that happens, you still need to find other guys that are really productive. David Stearns has talked about this offseason, that it's great to have those bulldogs, to have those guys who are carrying you in the rotation. But, depth is important, and there's a lot of ways to get to a competent starting rotation. So what the Mets need more than anything is for 2 of their 2 through 4 starters to actually put together great seasons. And the guys I'm talking about are the ones I just mentioned, Severino, Quintana, and Manaea. 2 of those 3 guys have to work. Severino, in a vacuum, I like all of these guys. The signing for Severino, 1 year, $13 million. That's not a bad signing in this market. The problem is just the expectation that he has to really step up. Because if he doesn't, it's hard to find the other guy that can be an impact pitcher in this rotation. In 2022, he had a 3.19 ERA, and that was in 19 starts. He had a flat FIP of just 1. So that's exactly 1 base runner allowed per inning over 9. That's really good. He has good stuff, but last year, whether he was tipping pitches, whether he was just in his head, combination of both, he was awful. And of these 4 starters, if there's one guy that would be out of the rotation by June, it's Severino. There is so much, in flux when it comes to Luis Severino. He's very polarizing with which way he could end up going. But the Mets need him, and if they don't, they're going to need a lot from their 2 lefties. Now, Jose Quintana is capable. In 2022, he pitched to a 2.93 ERA in 165 and 2/3 innings pitched. Last year, he's hurt for a large portion of the season, comes back down the stretch, makes 13 starts with the Mets, has a 3.57 ERA. Now, there's still a world where Quintana can be the 2022 guy and can get you to 160 innings and can be a guy that pitches to a low 3 ERA, if not a high 2 ERA. I love what I saw from him last year, but he's another year older. So expecting him to go out there and be your number 2 is a very tall ask. I think it's a Sean Manaea. He had a 3.44 ERA in his final 91 and 2/3 innings pitched last year. Large portion of that came out of the bullpen, though. So can he be that guy in a starting rotation? Can he face the lineup 3 times through? That's a huge question, really, for most of these guys, honestly. Outside of Senga, I don't know if any of these guys are going to see a lineup 3 times through much, which is going to put a ton of strain on the bullpen. If this Mets team is going to be successful this year, it's going to take Senga being, again, a top 10 Cy Young finisher, an absolute ace, and the bulldog in this rotation, which, as far as innings pitched, it is still tough because we don't know if he's going to pitch on, 4 days rest or if he's still going to need the extra rest throughout the season. And then you're going to need 2 of those other 3 guys in Severino, Quintana, and Manaea to pitch to a sub 4 ERA, if not a sub 3.5 ERA. If you get all 3 of them in the 3.8 range, you're cooking with gas, honestly. I mean, that would be honestly great for this team. If they had that and Senga was an ace, all right. But just based on the volatility of starting pitching, one of those 3 guys is going to get hurt. And, there's a chance that they might not all be effective either. So that's really where this season is going to hinge one way or the other. Those 3 guys, if you actually get, peak performance from them, or at least 2 of them, and Kodai Senga does his thing, then I think the Mets have enough. I wouldn't even call it frontline starting pitching. I just call it quality starting pitching to be able to win with defense, with hopefully a good bullpen, and with their lineup really carrying them. But this is not a team that is going to go 1 through 5 and just carry over series by series, week by week, month by month, where their starting pitching is pulling them to a playoff spot. It's not the 2022 Mets where we just saw Max Scherzer and Chris Bassett and even Taijuan Walker, all those guys when I had great seasons. Jacob deGrom obviously came in down the stretch, but they were able to put together a rotation, even having David Peterson pitch, really well in stretches. McGill had his moments. They found a way with that group to really be successful. I think this team lacks some of that frontline punch, but they do have enough options where they can get by and they can be an above 500 team. I think that's really what the goal is at this point, to be slightly above 500, where you can either make a big move at the deadline if you think you're close, or you can just hang around and maybe a fun playoff team that has a wild card exit, or you might even, sneak yourself into the first round of the playoffs in the divisional round. But it still can be a team that's entertaining to watch. And I do think that when it comes to having enough depth in that rotation, David Stearns has accomplished that this offseason to put together a team that has a fighting chance. I want to talk about the depth that this team has in just a minute. But first, today's episode is brought to you by Jase Medical. I know we come to sports to escape some of the crazy realities of real life, but can we talk for just a minute about preparing for tough situations? Whether you're on extended travel, if you're bracing for a major weather event, or if you're limited by another supply shortage, you are covered if you go to Jase Medical. Thanks to our partners, they provide life-saving antibiotics and a long list of daily medications that can be ordered in a 1-year supply, even ED generics like Cialis or Viagra. And also, Jase Medical has the Jase case. My wife and I, we like to travel, and we never leave without our Jase case because this provides us with 5 different antibiotics that treat 50-plus infections. These are bacterial infections that include UTIs, respiratory illness, sinusitis, skin infections, among others. This stuff can happen to any of us, and you want to be prepared. You can visit jasemedical.com and complete your physician encounter. It'll be reviewed by a board-certified physician, and your medications will be dispersed by a licensed pharmacy at a fraction of the regular cost. It's never been more important to be prepared than today. Go to JaceMedical.com and use offer code Locked On to get $20 off your order. If you're an everyday listener of the show that loves your Mets content, you should consider becoming a Locked On Mets insider. This is our text and service where I can send you updates anytime the Mets make a move. I can also send you an article that I might have wrote or some stats that I pulled on the Mets for a future show. And you can ask me questions anytime. This is some bonus coverage that some of you have already been getting for some time now. I really appreciate all of you who have already subscribed, all of you who still will subscribe. You can find the link in the episode description. Go to subtext.com/locked on Mets. Now, I think if you look at what David Stearns has done this offseason, he has really accomplished getting depth for this starting rotation. If you compare the Mets group right now to other teams in baseball, the list is a lot longer than you're going to find out there. So many teams go into the season and they just go 1 through 5, or maybe they go 1 through 6, 1 through 7. But very few teams can stack up 8 starting pitching options like the Mets can right now. Are all of them great? Not necessarily, but I don't think there's any really bad option in the group. You have, of course, the 4 guys we've already talked about today in Senga, Quintana, Severino, Manaea, all viable major league starters. Severino's coming off the worst year, but again, these are guys that would be in a lot of rotations. Tyler McGill and Adrian Hauser are clearly major league pitchers, and they're falling into that swingman category. One of those guys is probably going to win the 5th starter job. My money right now would be on Adrian Hauser. Last year, he pitched to a 4.12 ERA and 111 and a third innings pitched. Meanwhile, Tyler McGill got over 120 innings pitched, which was good for him. He had a 4.70 ERA, but did really thrive down the stretch, a 2.76 ERA. I believe he was dealing with a little bit of an injury that he sort of rectified down the stretch, and that helped him have that good final month. We've seen it in spurts with McGill. I don't necessarily trust him to be a guy that can be in your rotation for an entire season and dominate. I think the hopes of that have sort of come to pass. But can he be a decent number 5 starter? Can he be a good swingman that goes from the bullpen to the rotation? I think he can, and that's pretty quality depth to have, especially when you go beyond that. You have Jose Budo, who last year pitched to a 3.64 ERA as a rookie in 42 innings. He has a great changeup. He seemed to get a lot better compared to a debut that went awful. I think that was in 2022. But, he came back. He was attacking hitters, and I liked what I saw from Budo in the big leagues. The funny thing is he didn't pitch well in the minors last year, but he showed up and looked pretty good. He's not a bad depth option. And you still have Joey Lucchesi, who his numbers actually look great last year, a 2.89 ERA and 46 and 2/3 innings pitched. He did have some dominance in AAA. He's a major league pitcher. And is he guaranteed to be in rotations around the league? Definitely not. But he'd be competing for a lot of rotation spots. And again, just good depth to have. And that's not even mentioning David Peterson, who is hurt for the first half of the season at least, but could come back in the second half, and he has really good stuff and could be an impact arm either in the bullpen or in the rotation. So that's sort of 8.5 guys when you look at Peterson being a half-season pitcher this year. It's a lot of depth, and that's not even looking at the minor leagues. And again, I had a full show breaking down the top 4 arms in the Mets farm system in my eyes between Christian Scott, Mike Vassell, Dominic Hamill, and Blade Tidwell. I think the first 3 I mentioned there, and Scott, Vassell, and Hamill, could all potentially make an appearance this season in a Mets uniform. So that expands your depth beyond 10 to, a dozen potential options that could start games for you this year. That's a lot of depth, and a lot more depth than you're going to find in the game. I would never say that the Mets have a better rotation than the Phillies, but they do have more depth. The Phillies got Zach Wheeler and Aaron Nola. Ranger Suarez is the number 3, is probably better than anything the Mets have outside of Kodai Senga. And that ace duo they have is far better than anything the Mets have. But beyond that, you look at what else they're rolling out. Taijuan Walker, Christopher Sanchez, and then they're hoping for maybe some young guys. There's not a ton of depth there. And you're going to see that around the game because teams, especially when depth costs you $14 million for some of these pitchers, teams are just going to rely on youth in a lot of cases. You have to give the Mets some credit because, yes, they could have gone into this season and really been aggressive, or gone to this offseason, I should say, and been aggressive. Made some trades, made some big signings and continue to push the chips forward to try to win a World Series. And obviously that's what Mets fans always want. But there's also an alternative where they could have sat on their hands and done nothing. There are still teams out there like the Miami Marlins that have not spent $1 in free agency. The Mets could have just said, you know what? We got a ton of dead money on our books. Let's trade Jose Quintana while we can, collect some money there. We'll just roll into the season with a rotation of Senga and Lucchesi and Budo and McGill, and we'll just let Scott and Vassell compete. And Justin Jarvis, who they traded for last year, is not really much of a prospect, but still a top 30 guy, and he's close. He's in AAA. They could have just sort of completely punted the season. But they make the trade for Hauser, and they spend $14 million this upcoming season on Manaea and $13 on Severino. That's still expanding your depth and allowing guys like McGill, Lucchesi, and Budo to fall out of your top 5 and into the spots they should really belong in at 6, 7, 8. So I think the Mets have enough depth to get through the season. I'm excited to watch the young kids potentially come up and make an impact. I'm hopeful that some of these guys they brought in Manaea and Severino and even Hauser to a certain extent, can have a really nice year. They're all pitching for contracts, so that can be a good thing. And also can go the other way. If the Mets aren't competitive at all, but their pitching has been pretty good, all those guys I just mentioned could be trade chips at the deadline, including Quintana. You could have 4 viable starting pitchers that you could flip if you were in that position to be sellers again. So the Mets have really kept all their options open. They haven't tied up future flexibility, but this is still a team that wants to be competitive and wants to win. And that rotation is going to need some help to be able to really put together a winning nature that'll get them into the conversation for the playoffs. And that's what I want to talk about next. What else has to happen for this team to actually be good this year? And it comes down to bullpen and defense. So we're going to get to that in just a minute. First, though, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The NFL regular season has wrapped up, but there's still time to get in on the action with FanDuel, which is America's #1 sports book. You got the playoffs now, and FanDuel is offering new customers $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bets, win or lose. And there's so many different ways that you can bet, like live same-game parlays. You can find new bets in the Explore tab. You can make a parlay in the Parlay Hub, which is the best way to find popular parlays. And you still got the NBA season going on as well right now. So there's always star players to bet on each night. You can find a parlay, including some players, different teams. There's a lot of different ways that you can play at FanDuel. And also remember, again, you place that $5 money line bet, you get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed, win or lose. Visit FanDuel.com/locked-on to make your first bet a layup. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. When you look through the New York Mets rotation options, what's a little bit hard to find is strikeouts. Kodai Senga is going to rack up some Ks. Severino is right. He'll certainly strike out some batters, and maybe Sean Manaea will as well. But for the most part, a lot of these guys are going to pitch to contact. And this is where run prevention can take many forms. And David Stearns is really counting on defense to be a catalyst in winning for the Mets this year. Look at the top defense the Mets could put together on a given night. Or let's just say they got a 2-1 lead and they're heading into the 8th inning, what they could put forth. You could have Brandon Nimmo in left, where I think his defense is going to play up a little bit more because his arm's not going to be as much of a liability. And if he's in left, it means Harrison Bader's in center. He's going to be covering a lot of ground in the gaps. So Nimmo could focus a little bit more on the corner, protecting the line. That's going to help the Mets a ton. Right field, you could put Tyrone Taylor out there. He's got a strong arm as well. So all of a sudden, you got 2 strong arms in the outfield. And actually, if you have Starling Marte playing, you have 3 great arms in the outfield. Nimmo's the one liability. DJ Stewart, not a great defender in any way. But the Mets have some really good defenders out there that can run down fly balls, particularly in close games. Francisco Lindor is the best shortstop in baseball defensively. I don't really care what other name you want to throw at me. You can pitch your other shortstops, but I defy to find one who's got a longer track record who's going to go out there and be more durable. So Lindor at short, massive for this team. Jeff McNeil at second base. He's still a really good defensive second baseman. He's going to be playing more of the position this year, which I think is only going to make him better as he is comfortable in that one spot. Obviously, Jeff's going to still move around. You're going to see him in left. You're going to see him in right. You might even see him in center every once in a while. Probably not too much with Bader and Taylor coming in, but it could happen. And you might even see him at third base this year, depending on how everything breaks. But for a large portion of the season, I imagine he's planted at second. That gives you great defense up the middle, particularly when Bader's in center. To have Lindor, McNeil, Bader, and Alvarez behind the dish with the way he caught last year, it's really good defense. Your casualties, your liabilities, I would say, actually, that's in the corners of the infield with Pete Alonso and potentially Brett Beatty or Mark Vientos, who's even a worse defender than Beatty. But I don't think Alonso really hurts you. From what I've watched throughout his career, the guy gives effort. He's pretty good around the bag. I think he's fine at first base. And Brett Beatty did have moments like spring training leading into the beginning of last season where his confidence was there and he looked like a really promising defender at third. So I still think that can be in there. And the fact is, late in games, you could always replace him with Joey Wendell. And there's also going to be games where Joey Wendell's going to start too, either at third base or at second, where he's a really good defender. And you're just going to see the Mets kind of steal back some runs that their pitchers might be giving up by playing really good defense. That's going to be a big part of what could make this team a surprise to a lot of people this year. The other thing is going to be this bullpen. And really, the funny thing is, this is all David Stearns. This is going to show you if this guy is as good as Steve Cohen and the Mets hope he is at leading a front office, because he's trying to find that hidden value. And you might note that in a lot of these signings, which are bounce back guys, but it's identifying, all right, this team's going to try to value defense since there's not a ton of offense on this free agent market. So they're going to lean into that. And then being able to discover some gems in that bullpen, that's what the best franchises in the game do. And the Mets are trying to get to that level. That's why they've signed a dozen guys, it feels like, this offseason, either to major league deals, Jorge Lopez, split contracts, Tonkin, and the other name is escaping me. There's been a ton that have been added this year. And then all these minor league signings with invitations to spring training. All these different guys, which I have broken down in past podcasts, they all have a pitch that jumps out to you, or had a season a couple of years ago where they're great. And you're hoping that a couple of them can really have breakout seasons and the Mets can put together a competent bullpen. Also, you got the best closer in baseball back. With a good bullpen, great defense, this team can find success. But there's a lot of pressure on those two components, especially when the rotation's maybe going to be 5 and dive a lot of times. So you're going to need length out of that bullpen from some of these guys as well. Luckily, between those guys who are on the fringe of the rotation and McGill, Budo, Lucchesi, you have some options for long relief. And Michael Tonkin's another guy that gives you some long relief. Still, this team, in my eyes, if they're actually trying to, field a competitive roster, which despite, again, maybe the lack of blockbuster moves, so to speak, they made this offseason, it's not like the Mets haven't been adding players. They've actually been adding more players than a lot of teams in baseball. They are really trying to just bring a ton of different pieces into this organization. They are trying. They got to do more in that bullpen. They have to. If they can just add at least one, if not two, high leverage relievers to pair with Diaz, and you can shorten games, which you need to do considering your options in the rotation. And obviously, the onus is still on the line to put runs on the board. But I actually think the Mets can win more games than a lot of people are going to expect going into the season. I think they can be a real underdog story. And honestly, I think they could be a team that suddenly becomes a lot of fun to watch, because sometimes when your expectations are low, it's a good place to start where guys can exceed them. Sometimes it's better to be, going into the season projected for 79 wins, because all of a sudden, if you win 84, it's an extreme success compared to be going in, projected to win 94 games and you win 82 and it's a massive disappointment. So I think there really is some room for optimism. I do think the Mets have enough starting pitching right now, but they got to add to that bullpen. And we'll be talking about that on a show this week. Although if there is no signings, I'm going to go with a pretty polarizing topic tomorrow, just because I've gotten so many people asking me about it throughout this offseason, and that's Trevor Bauer. The Mets seem to have a rotation that's full, but Trevor Bauer is out there, and if you ignore all the other stuff and just focus on the pitching, there is upside, but is all the other stuff worth ignoring? I'll be talking about that again. Very polarizing topic on tomorrow's show. Appreciate all of you who tuned into that one. If you don't want to miss it and you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit that subscribe button. As I'm saying this, I think we're getting pretty close to the 8,000 subs. I have it in front of me. I'd appreciate all of you subscribe to get us to that next goal. Also, of course, if you're listening on the audio side, please follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show at Locked On Mets. If you want to be a Locked On Mets insider, you can find the link in the episode description. And now that you made it to the end of the show, check out Locked On Sports Today, which is the first ever 24/7 streaming channel covering everything in the world of sports with our local experts from each team and our league-wide experts from each league. You can follow Locked On Sports Today on YouTube, streaming 24/7.